Hello and welcome. I'm Rawia Alami and this is the Dailies, where we take a look at important news stories, reports, analysis and articles published in newspapers and media outlets across the world. Most newspapers continue to cover the Ukraine drone attack on Russian air bases a couple of days ago, delving into its details and analyzing its meaning and repercussions. Another story continued to attract attention, particularly by European newspapers, and that is the unexpected victory of the far-right candidate Karol Nawrocki in Poland's presidential elections, with many viewing it as a testament of the rising right-wing tide in Europe. The Financial Times, for one, published an article by Jarosław Kukiz analyzing Poland's presidential election and looking at the causes of such a victory. Kukiz, who is editor-in-chief of the Polish weekly Kultura Liberalna, contends that this outcome marks a significant setback for advocates of liberal democracy, particularly following Donald Tusk's successful parliamentary campaign earlier this year. The article highlights the lack of effective communication and delivery of promised reforms by Tusk's coalition government, which contributed to voter backlash. The author goes on to say that Nawrocki's win not only threatens the rule of law, but also indicates a growing trend of popularism in Poland, reflecting broader European dynamics. Despite this defeat, the article emphasizes that the competitive democratic process remains intact, paving the way for potential liberal reforms and strategic preparations as Tusk eyes the 2027 elections. Le Monde's editorial seems to agree with Kukiz, saying that Poland's presidential election has indeed shocked Europe. The victorious far-right candidate Nawrocki, a historian with no political experience, was backed by the International or Nationalist Law and Justice Party. The editorial notes that the win highlights deep divisions in Poland, with cities voting centrists and rural areas supporting the right. The article notes that Nawrocki's victory is a blow to Prime Minister Tusk's pro-European government, which now faces a powerful president likely to use his veto. The result signals growing far-right influence in Europe, encouraged by the Trump administration. Nawrocki supports the EU and NATO, but will resist Ukraine joining NATO. The article warns that centrists are struggling as nationalism rises across the region. Yesterday, the British Strategic Defence Review was officially published, and today the Times published an in-depth report on the review, describing it as the most radical defence review we've seen for a generation, aiming to make Britain battle-ready, armour-clad and ready for war in response to a new era of threats from Russia and also China. The report highlights that the Radical Defence Review stands out as the first since 1989 not to recommend cuts, but instead it calls for significant investment and modernization. The article also highlights how all 62 recommendations were accepted, reflecting a unified approach to new global threats. It also includes some details as to how the UK compares to other armed forces in the world. As you can see in this table here, the UK and France are indeed well behind the other countries mentioned on this table, namely the US, China and Russia, in many categories. The first category is the total active personnel, also in the main battle tanks, in the fighter and ground attack aircrafts and aircraft carriers, and also nuclear submarines, and finally also nuclear warheads. Now, with Russia and China identified as the main dangers, the review proposes more troops, better recruitment and a focus on advanced technology like drones, AI and cyber weapons. The commitment to build new submarines and invest in nuclear capabilities shows a serious intent to strengthen Britain's military. Overall, the article presents the review as a bold, forward-looking plan to keep the UK secure. This view was not shared by Charles Moore, who warned in the Telegraph today that despite the Strategic Defence Review published yesterday, the UK is not facing the hard military realities of the world. Moore's article reviews the challenges faced by democratic governments in preparing for war, using historic examples like Margaret Thatcher's reversal on defence cuts after the Falklands War. It argues that the leaders often avoid military spending until a direct threat appears. The author points to Ukraine's resilience and innovation against Russia as a lesson for Western nations, especially the UK. The piece suggests that Britain is not taking the Russian threat seriously enough, with low recruitment and limited readiness. It calls for learning from frontline NATO countries and warns that the UK's new defence review lacks clear solutions. The author also criticises striking NHS doctors, arguing that frequent strikes erode public respect and professional standards, worsening morale and financial prospects in the long run. The Guardian published an exclusive report describing a deliberate shift in Israeli military strategy. It reveals that recent deadly airstrikes on Gaza schools sheltering displaced Palestinians and civilians, of course, are part of a broader targeting effort following loosened controls on IDF actions at civilian sites. At least 6 schools have been struck, with over 120 reported dead, and more schools identified also as future targets. The report highlights that the IDF claims these sites are used by Hamas, but has not provided evidence. UN officials and human rights experts strongly condemn the attack as grave violations of international law and children's rights, noting that nearly all schools in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. The report concludes that this Israeli military strategy of deliberately targeting schools leaves a generation of Palestinian children without safe education and exposing them to lasting trauma. In her foreign policy column, Emma Ashford asked whether Trump will be the president to finally break America's addiction to Middle East interventions. In her analysis, Ashford highlights the evolving approach of President Donald Trump's second administration towards foreign policy, particularly regarding Iran. Unlike his first term, characterized by hardline tactics and also a maximum pressure strategy, Trump now appears more open to diplomatic engagement. The administration's efforts also to negotiate a deal with Iran are seen as crucial for establishing a more stable U.S. foreign policy and shifting focus to challenges posed by China. The article underscores the potential for success in these negotiations despite internal Republican pressures for a harder stance. Ultimately, the piece contends that the outcome of talks with Iran may determine Trump's legacy and signify a significant pivot away from prolonged military involvement in the Middle East. And we'll end with the New York Times, where Jonathan Sumption wrote discussing the alarming trend of democratic decline in Western nations, including the US. While these countries still have democratic institutions, their political cultures are weakening, according to the author. This shift can lead to authoritarianism, as seen in other nations. The author highlights President Trump as a symptom of this decline, showing a shift from governing by laws to personal discretion. Citizens increasingly expect the government to solve all problems, leading to disillusionment and a turn towards strong leaders. The piece warns that if Americans continue to elect authoritarian figures, democracy might not survive. It calls for a restoration of democratic values to prevent history from repeating itself. That's it for today. Thanks for watching.